thank you so much, and I'm thrilled with what a wonderful turnout we have tonight. I am the Community Engagement Director at Vermont PBS, and I have the best job, because what I get to do is I get to pick content, the PBS content, both local and national, and determine what would make great conversation, discussion to take into the community. And this is one of the films that I have been taking around and will be taking around over the next month or so. As Bill said, it's going to broadcast April 28th. And once again, you can catch it on my shameless commercial here, Vermont PBS. For the younger folks who will go to the website or use their smartphones or laptops or iPads, you can get it on your iPads. You can watch it in full, on demand, for free at your own convenience. But what I try to do is take it a step further, and what I call it is transmedia opportunity. And so what we do is we just don't watch it and say, yeah, that was nice, and turn it off and go about our business. What we try to do is build a conversation around it. Some of you have lived through it. Some of you were alive. It didn't penetrate what was going on. Personally, I graduated 40 years ago. I was the last year that had to register for the draft. The draft ended in 1972. I sat around the dining room table watching television with my parents, and we discussed politics every single night. While it may seem like ancient history, it is so important, and we've learned so many lessons. Hopefully we learn more lessons from it. As we look at war, we privatize war, we see what can happen and the impact of not just being in war, but leaving a country and our veterans. Today, we say thank you for your service. So many veterans of the Vietnam era didn't hear that, and it's a crime that they didn't. With that, I just want to thank you for coming. I look forward to the dialogue. I look forward to the great panel that Bill has assembled. And I want to thank Bill, Brattleboro Union High School, and the Brattleboro Historic Society, and Brattleboro Community TV. So thank you so much.
This war obviously has a legacy. It's gone on for many, many people for a long time and continues even to today.
I was 17, just a teenage kid, the year that I enlisted. I can't remember why I did. My mom said I insisted. I had some strange idea then that Uncle Sam was right. Oh, Mama cried, but she signed the card, and then I went off to fight. Got off the plane in Vietnam. It didn't seem like war. With all I saw, I started to wonder what I had come there for. Some officers got drunk at night and cheated on their wives, and the peasants on the other side were just struggling for their lives. Oh, the army tried some fancy stuff to bring them to their knees, like Agent Orange defoliants to kill the brush and trees. We'd hike all day on jungle trails through clouds of poison spray, and they never told me then that it would hurt my health today. But I got the news this morning, yeah, the doctors told me so. They killed me in Vietnam, and I didn't even know. I tried hard to forget the war like everybody did. Settled down, got married, even had a couple of kids. Well, my children both had birth defects, and the doctors had their doubts. They never could understand it, but I think I figured it out. 'Cause I got the news this morning, yeah, the doctors told me so. They killed me in Vietnam, and I didn't even know. an orange from Vietnam, we carry it with us still. It stays inside for years and years before it starts to kill. You might get cancer of the liver, you might get cancer of the skin. You can file for disability, but you might not live to win. Oh, I got the news this morning, yeah, the doctors told me so. They killed me in Vietnam, and I didn't even know. Oh, the doctor said I've got some time trying to be kind. I've never been a radical, but this has changed my mind. Oh, I'd be so proud to hear my kids say, hell no, I won't go. Because you killed my dad in Vietnam, and he didn't even know. Yes, I'd be so proud to hear my kid say, hell no, I won't go. Because you killed my dad in Vietnam, and he didn't even know.
Well, what I've seen so far was very moving, and I had never seen that part of, or that time in Vietnam before. I've been to Vietnam 11 times, each time 3 or 4 weeks at a time. 4 of those times were during the war, starting in 1969 and the last time in 1973. And after that, I was there 7 more times, studying the long-term effects of the war, starting in 1980, I think, and the last time in 1993. This particular war really was an innovative one. All wars do damage to the environment, but in this particular war, one of the major strategies for the U.S. to try to win was to destroy the environment. The enemy, the Viet Cong, were rural people depending upon the rural countryside, and while the U.S. controlled Saigon, we didn't control much of anything else in the country. And so the attempt was made to destroy the infrastructure and the food base and the cover and concealment for our enemy, the Viet Cong. The war started in 1961 and ended, as you heard, in 1975. And the spraying began quite secretly early on. I think the first minor spraying was in 1962, as we found out subsequently. But it wasn't until about 1965 or 6 that it became known, at least in the United States, that the U.S. was spraying forests in order to prevent the Viet Cong from being able to conceal themselves in the countryside. So a couple of scientists went over in the summer, July or August of 1969, and were prevented from leaving Saigon by the South Vietnamese. And so it was a very frustrating trip. They came home and they didn't really know what to do because they wanted to seek the information and find out whether in fact we were spraying forests and to what extent. Well, then by good fortune, and I put good fortune in quotation marks, the U.S. did a massive spraying in Cambodia secretly, which at that time was a neutral country just next door to Vietnam, as you know. And the spraying was done in order to impede the North Vietnamese from supplying the South Vietnamese. And so the spraying was done in the so-called fishhook area, about halfway between Saigon and Phnom Penh. And this became known because they did a huge amount of damage, these sprayings, a huge amount of damage to French rubber planters. The result was that the one of those two people who went over decided this was a wonderful opportunity to go back. The other fellow didn't really want to go, or his wife wouldn't let him or something. And so luckily I was recruited to go with him. And this is a professor of wildlife from the University of Montana. And he and I was a forest ecologist, so we complemented ourselves very nicely, wildlife management on the one hand and forest management on the other hand. Both of us had seen a year or more of intense combat as Marines previously, so we were either foolhardy enough or brave enough or stupid enough to go back and go into the war zone in Cambodia. And we were only bombed once at that time. The result was that there was quite a bit of publicity when we came back. We were there for almost 4 weeks, from December '69 into early January of 1970, and there was a lot of publicity of what we revealed, because it certainly wasn't known to any great extent that we were doing this or what was happening. Well, we immediately decided to go back again. So we decided as soon as school was over, the school semester was over, we'd go again in July and August of 1970. Well, I couldn't get a visa. The South Vietnamese were really pissed off with this adverse publicity they were getting. And now comes the first wonderfully serendipitous event. And that is that I knew reasonably well Senator Aiken. He came from Putney. He was then the senior Republican, very respected senator. I was reasonably close to him. My secretary at Windham College was his daughter. Within 3 days, I got a special courier with my visa. So Senator Aiken was able to do something about that. Bert Pfeiffer and I went over there in July, and the next thing we found out was that the Saigonese government wouldn't let us out of the city, which was exactly what happened the first time around when Pfeiffer and his colleague went earlier. So here again, enormous great good fortune. My wife and I at that time were on the board of the Wyndham World Affairs Council, as was also Ellsworth Bunker, a fellow who lived down the road in Dubberston, and we knew him quite well. He was at that time the ambassador to Vietnam, and so I got an audience with Bunker. I found out later that he had been ambassador for 4 years, and I was the first unofficial visitor that he received. We talked a little bit about local events, and then I told him my problem, and he said, "Oh gee, there's an awful bureaucracy here. I'll work on it and get permission for you to get out of the city. But in the meantime, I'll lend you my helicopter." And so for almost 2 weeks, my two colleagues and I, there was a graduate student from Harvard, Bob Cook, who's now the director of the Arnold Arboretum. we had the personal private use of this beautiful helicopter, and we could go anywhere we wanted to in South Vietnam as long as we landed at some Army or Marine base. We did a lot of investigations. We came home. We were interviewed on national television. I spoke 4 times before the Senate, Foreign Relations Committee, three Senate committees and 1 House committee. And also, interestingly enough, the military was very interested in the results. I was invited to speak at Fort Detrick, at the Pentagon, at the National War College, at West Point, and the military was really interested in learning what we had learned. Now, let me backtrack a little bit. In 1970, Ambassador Bunker said, when you're done, and that was 3 weeks later, when you're done, come, I'd like to see you again, and you tell me what you saw. Well, we told him that the forest devastation was damaging mainly civilians, and that there were even hints that there were health problems. Ducks, geese, chickens were dying, and people were complaining that they were feeling sick, and so on. And as soon as Bunker, who was quite a hawk, by the way, as soon as Bunker heard this, he immediately put out the order in early August of 1970 to stop the spraying. It's really to his credit, because he was very anti-communist and very pro. He really, at that time, thought we should be winning the war. But he stopped the U.S. spraying. The South Vietnamese sprayed a little bit more for another 6 months, but we stopped the massive spraying. The most important thing, I think, is not only did we reveal to the world the extent of the spraying, we learned that an even more secret aspect of the spraying wasn't forest spraying, but crop spraying. So in fact, 20% of our spraying, give or take a few gallons, was to destroy crops. And the Rand Corporation did a study at that time which pointed out that you had to destroy crops for about 10 to 20 civilians to let them not be able to eat in order to stop one Viet Cong soldier from not getting enough food. So it was a terrible situation, the crop destruction. But even more important, people hadn't realized that this was really an anti-ecological war. We were not only spraying, we were also bulldozing. We bulldozed 2% of that country, clearing it with these huge tractors, which were made in Rome, Georgia, so they were called Rome plows. And you won't believe this, we bombed so massively that the bombing amounted to the equivalent of 1 Hiroshima bomb every 10 days for 10 years, or for 12 years. It was the amount of bombing was unbelievable. 13 million 500-pound bombs, which comes to 9,000 pounds a day for a period of from 65 to 73 or something like that. An unbelievable amount. But that wasn't all. We also tried to start wildfires. Unfortunately for us, it didn't work. The area was too wet, too humid, and so half a dozen attempts in the Delta region to start massive wildfires all fizzled out. So that didn't work. Then we also tried to then make it even wetter so that the Ho Chi Minh Trail became impassable. So we ran 2,700 seed clouding sorties in order to attempt to get the rain to come and get the area impassable. That didn't really work too much either. I met Julie in August of 1970 when they were making prostheses for these poor people who had their feet blown off by residual unexploded munitions. 5 to 10 to 12% of all the artillery and bombs that you fire don't work. And so they sit around, and most of them then still don't ever work. But some of them do when you bump into them. And so there was the so-called UXO, unexploded ordnance problem. But that was only part of it. The worst of it was we dropped 1.5 million cluster bombs. Cluster bombs, those 1.5 million cluster bombs included 750 submunitions called bomblets, little things like hand grenade size or this size, like softball size. And these things only were supposed to explode in some cases, in others they were meant to work like mines. But there again, about 10% of them didn't function until some child later bumped into them. And you won't believe this, but in the 40 years since the war, since 1975 to 2015, there have been 40,000 fatalities and 65,000 maimings from residual unexploded ordnance. An incredible problem. And that's, I would say, the Agent Orange that was used had a small impurity in it that nobody knew about at first, but it became evident quite soon, called dioxin. And that was toxic, cancerogenic, and teratogenic. In other words, it caused illness or death, or it caused cancer, or it caused birth defects. And it's a little difficult to say how serious that issue is because the records are very poor. The pre-war records of the actual incidence of these problems is never quite clear in the rural areas. So that has become a major problem, as probably all of you know, but it's an ill-defined one. On the other hand, the unexploded ordnance has now maimed or killed 105,000 people since 1975. We also, of course, use landmines, and landmines, you know, are another pernicious thing. The reason landmines are so nasty is they're meant to go off when you bump into them, and they're placed in such a way that you're not supposed to be able to find them. And so therefore, they are also a very, very nasty weapon. There are now a couple of treaties, worldwide international treaties, that have grown out of the Vietnam War. World War I, you know, resulted in a ban on chemical weapons. World War II resulted in a treaty preventing genocide, meaning to prevent genocide, and the Vietnam War ended up, for the first time, making environmental damage something that the military was not allowed to do.
You spoke so eloquently about what you said, which counters, I think, a very flawed film. I won't go into that. But could you say a few things about, the film talks about the immigration problems of those who are trying to get out. Could you speak a little bit about what was done to the villages, the concentration camps, the forced, you know what I'm talking about?
The South Vietnamese.
What the South Vietnamese and the Americans did to the South Vietnamese in terms of their villages, their burial, the forced evacuation into concentration camps. Could you say a few words about that?
We were trying to prevent the Viet Cong from being able to function. And so therefore we wanted to prevent them from getting things to eat. And so the best way to do that, we thought, was to evacuate hundreds of villages and bring them into, what was it called, the secure,
Hamlets, yeah.
Strategic hamlets.
Say that?
Strategic hamlets.
strategic hamlets, that's what Jerry called concentration camps. And so, on the one hand, we did a huge amount of crop spraying. On the other hand, we tried to gather in the civilians to the extent possible so that they couldn't provide sustenance for the Viet Cong.
Well, in Quang Ngai, where I lived, there was a strategic hamlet on the Battlegan Peninsula, which was very near us. And also there was an enormous amount of road plowing in Quang Ngai province, just absolutely taking a lush, vibrant, growing ecology and totally destroying it, just turning it into a moonscape. I mean, it's really unimaginable to think of a world full of rice paddies and dikes and trees and little villages, and to imagine it gone. And then to say that, and I think this is the Heart and Minds campaign, am I right? That people were voting with their feet to move into these strategic hamlets where they would be safe. And of course, those hamlets were tents provided by the military in these, I mean, Battlegan was on a very sandy plain. There were no trees there. It was surrounded by barbed wire. And contrast that with the lives that those people had been living. And also that the US imagined naively that those were enclaves that would actually be for the South, when that was not the truth at all. I mean, everything was so porous. There was this fantasy about what was controlled and what wasn't. Two of the members on our team, for example, went out to a local village which was quote unquote safe during the day. Their bike got stuck in the dirt, and their motorbike, and they couldn't get out. Well, at night, the other side came in, right? So who did what belong to? They were captured, they were held for about 11 days until we finally got them back. But Americans were just so incredibly naive, and I think in reading Seymour Hersh's article this past week in the New Yorker, I don't know how many of you saw it. I lived about 6 kilometers away from My Lai, and when Western visitors would come, they always wanted to go there. And when we talked to villagers, as we did, they'd always say, why here? What's so special about this place? Why do you come here? And that was in his article. I was so interested in that. And that article then went on to talk about these American kids who were set out in these conditions that they did not understand, culturally totally unprepared for, and without enough careful supervision so that they really understood what the Geneva Conventions were. I mean, even if you follow the rules of war, which I'm not particularly interested in as a pacifist and a nonviolent believer in the fact that nonviolent action is the best way to resolve things. But even from a military point of view, what we were doing was just so confused from top to bottom, and I don't feel we've changed. I really don't. You know, I can't think that we're doing any better in Afghanistan.
And remember the 2.5 million Vietnamese who died. I just want to, my heart goes out to the soldiers from the United States, from those who worked for the South Vietnamese, those who worked for the North Vietnamese. They were all young people. They all followed the recommendations of older men in each country, and many of them were stalwart believers. I remember in Da Nang speaking with one soldier from South Vietnam who was distraught because everything he had been taught since a kid was being turned over very quickly. And he says, we were the righteous cause. We were told we were the righteous cause, but we were not. He was just devastated. anyway, my heart goes out to all of the soldiers who, and those today also in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places, that we're asking to carry on the policies that are, seem very appropriate for this day, but don't really take into account how they came to be, and they certainly don't take into account of how they will be in the future. I think those of you who know servicemen, please be appreciative of the service that they have provided, and the service women. I happen to work with a population right now, and many of them have done this work, and they are severely injured in terms of emotionally, and our support and our care of them can be great help.
You indicated we didn't learn any lesson from our problem in Vietnam, and you're right, we have not. What happened in Afghanistan and Iraq is a good example. Thank God there is a negotiation between Iran and the United States going well. I hope that will be there, otherwise it would be another mistake. But could you help me, being in a school here and having children and grandchildren, what do you recommend that our society should do that these sort of mistakes that has caused so much death, so many deaths, so many parts of the world would not repeat again in the future?
A lot of this stuff will be correct. I think it's part of the sad part of human nature, part of nationalism. That we let our blood get boiling, really over semantics. And then that turns into all kinds of national and international actions. So I don't think it's preventable. I think we learn as we go along, but God knows we learn very slowly, incrementally. And you're listening to an obvious pessimist. I'm not an optimist about how mankind controls itself and conducts itself in the world. We have centuries now of history of repeated and repeated transgressions, terror, and all the rest that goes with it. So it'd be nice, I'd love to be able to say, I see the good days coming, but I don't really. I don't think they're all going to be bad, but they're going to be bad days.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Morse. I was drafted into the Army in 1965 in July, and I was one of the lucky ones who didn't go. Instead, I was assigned to Fort Detrick, and as a successful medic trainee, I was assigned to be a virology technician. And what we did, and there was never any explicit confirmation of what we were doing, but it was obviously biological warfare that we were researching. And there were other people in my unit who were researching dissemination bombs and lots of other things. And there were conscientious objectors who were volunteers to be guinea pigs. Every street at Fort Detrick is named, or was named at the time, for someone who died in the research. My particular office, the section of the, this is so difficult to talk about having seen this, knowing what we really try to do as a military nation. It's unbelievable that what I was doing was helping research to try to make Rocky Mountain spotted fever and eastern and western equine encephalitis viable in the air.
I talk about the plant destroying agents, forest destroying agents, and crop destroying agents. But I should mention, just as an aside, that we also sprayed 9 million tons of riot control agents during the war. And this was not to control riots, let's say in these strategic hamlets or somewhere. This was to flush Viet Cong out of protected holes or bunkers or this or that, so they could be shot down. So we not only used incredible amounts of chemical anti-plant agents, but also 9 million tons of anti-personnel agents during that war. There was quite a bit of napalm used, but it was largely ineffectual. It did not have as massive effect as a 500-pound bomb, so they actually phased out the napalm quite a bit.
We saw a lot of it.
Well, you may have seen a lot, but it was a downward trend of use because they found that bombing was better than napalm.
So with that kind of arithmetic, I want to come back to what I consider the critical question, which is, what do we do? We don't want this to go on. What do we do? And as a teacher in my post-Vietnam life, I think that's a question I asked all the time professionally in the classroom. How do I ask myself and my students to really examine their attitudes, to examine any moment in which we are prejudiced or biased against others? I view the roots of all wars as similar to those of all acts of genocide, in which we allow ourselves to view another person as someone other than ourselves, somehow inhuman, somehow less. I think this is what we see in all the history of racism as we look at it, sexism, on and on. And so, to me, the real challenge as a human being is to try and face in myself any time when I push others away, and to be part of action that calls out for really recognizing all beings as having an essential right to be here, to be alive, to flourish. And how do we do that? That's the question.
Let me say something on a slightly more practical basis, something we could aim for.
That's what they always say.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful, and I'm with you 100%. There are two heroes in Vermont that we haven't mentioned yet. One is Patrick Leahy, who has spent decades trying to stop the U.S. from using landmines and more recently cluster munitions. And then there's Jody Williams, who at the time was in Putney, who actually, despite enormous opposition from the U.S. government, finally got Norway and Canada to help her develop an anti-mine treaty. And let me mention that every single ally of ours, every single NATO country, I shouldn't have said every ally, not Israel, every single NATO country has joined the Anti-Mine Convention and have agreed to get rid of them all, and every single NATO country has agreed to stop using cluster munitions. The only holdout is the United States. So here is something on a somewhat more practical basis that people could try to work towards, and you do it perhaps through education. Those are things that bother me terribly, that we stand alone in the so-called free world in permitting or continuing to use landmines and cluster munitions. China, Russia, and Israel are the other major ones, by the way.
This might be encouraging to you a little bit. We have a student organization here at BUHS,
Yeah, there it is.
non-political in all sincerity, but attempting to help people who are being maimed by unexploded ordnance. And we're partnered with Project Renew, that you know a lot about, obviously, Dr. Westing, and we call ourselves Students for Renew. That's the good news, but currently we're quasi-dormant.
It helped to make a house for a woman over in Vietnam. And a lot of the money that gets sent over there helps the people figure out ways to make a living for themselves.
Yeah.
So is that not an improvement, the fact that we don't use those, if we don't, that we don't use Agent Orange anymore, we don't use napalm anymore, we seem to put more effort, though far from perfect one, into not harming civilians, and most importantly, that now that we don't have a draft, this is all happening at a fraction of the scale that it did in Vietnam and the wars of that time. So haven't the...
Not so for the people on the ground. I mean, one of the very tricky things about drones is that there's a remove from those who are affected, from those who are injured. In a way, one could say the Vietnam vets had a chance to see what they were doing very directly, and a chance then to respond and to learn from that, no matter how painful. And I think our technology has allowed a remove that may be very difficult for people. The other thing I wanted to say is that one of the things that existed in Vietnam was a very active press. The US press, the media, was very there and recorded things. We could see it, the people. And that's not as true as it was, and that's a problem. So, and then I think that is also part of the technology. When someone is sitting, I don't know, where are they sitting?
Montana.
Say where?
Montana.
Montana.
That's where drones.
Is that where it is?
Well, it's one of many places.
Yeah, I have no idea. And is operating the battlefield from such a great distance. There's no press there watching. And the people who are operating the drones themselves are not right next to what's happening. And I think that's a big problem.
pretend to follow our policies about chemical warfare and such, and more importantly that, even taking into account the highest numbers of enemy and civilian casualties from the drones, from the wars, it's a fraction of what it was in Vietnam. Isn't that an improvement in a way?
Oh, body count. No, I can't respond to that. Is there someone in the audience? I don't know body counts now.
No one does because of the press.
I think this is part of the problem for me, is that I, who am interested, don't know as much as I should.
You remember Congressman Kucinich, who ran for president a number of times. He was on television once with a bunch of, I think, 4 or 5 researchers and 4 or 5 members of the press, sometime around 2006. They had done research going house to house in Iraq, and they determined that there were, after the shooting part of the, during the early phases of the Iraq War, the second one, there was house-to-house coverage. They determined that 500,000 civilian deaths was a conservative estimate. Kucinich, unlike any of our other senators or congresspeople, as far as I know, apologized for that. So that's some indication of the degree of civilian deaths as a result of the Iraq War. I think there are probably other experts who know much more than I, who would give other harrowing statistics that make me at least believe that we have not improved at all.
Early on, Jerry Levy reminded us of the concentration camps, as he called them, or the strategic villages, and other aspects of doing nasty things to the local populace. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned, so I just throw it in quickly, is that we also ended up destroying about half a dozen villages in their entirety. The most famous or notorious of these was My Lai, but that was only one of about half a dozen such. In one of them, I forgot the name of it, unfortunately, the commanding officer was asked afterwards by some journalist why he had done it. And he came up with a beautiful statement. We had to destroy that village in order to save it. And that was a quotation that at that time went around the world.
Saying this anyway, but when he talked about Kucinich apologizing and how can we do better in the future, questions that naturally get raised in a forum like this one. But it's occurred to me, and I'm sure to many people in this room many times, and given what we've heard tonight, again, I've been thinking this, and I'm sure I'm not alone, but ever since I read Noam Chomsky say that over 2 million people died in Vietnam, that not only have we never apologized as in any official capacity, but given our country now, it's unimaginable that we could apologize. It's given the politics of our country, even people like Leahy or Welcher, I mean, Kucinich was a successful politician, but he's no longer here. But it's just unimaginable, even from a liberal politician, that to stand up politically and say that we drop 9,000 pounds of bombs every day for 13 years, that we killed 2.5 million people, that terrible, and the poisonous things that you've talked about, Arthur, that we as a country or even individual politicians could publicly apologize, it's unimaginable. That's our country now. That it's not going to happen. It's impossible. What does that say about us as a people? That are, you can't stand up publicly and say a representative of people and say we committed the most unspeakable war crimes on all kinds of different fronts. So that's who we are.
Well,
That's my comment.
I don't want that to be who we are.
Good.
And
Good.
I want to say that one of the things I think that's very important to recognize is how many vets have gone back to Vietnam and how much they've done. That's been very, very positive. And My Lai is one of the places where a very early vets group went and has gone often, and has done a lot of service work there. There's an enormous memorial there now. It's a good place to visit. It's a good place to go.
I could just mention a concrete example. You saw a picture of Pete McCloskey, the Marine officer who is noted for having personally bayoneted more enemy soldiers than any other Marine in modern history. He won, I think, 5 Navy Crosses and half a dozen Purple Hearts and this and that. Quite recently, he went to North Vietnam to try to make peace with his former enemy and with himself. It was a very touching visit a year or two ago when he went to Hanoi and sought out, in fact, some of the people he specifically fighting against.
I don't think the press back then was so good, because I remember arguing with people saying, but, you know, the New York Times prints all the news, and I didn't read it about the Times, and Putney had a very active underground press that at least publicized a lot of stuff that wasn't getting into the official newspapers.
It is teachers who are going to help us continue to grow